They were never supposed to exist. Not in the history books, not in the records, not even in memory. But they did. In 1942, as the world was being torn apart by war, the United States government turned to a forgotten people, not for diplomacy, not for peace, but for something far older, far darker. They came to the San Carlos Apache with a proposition, a secret program, a new kind of warfare, one that didn't rely on tanks or planes or bombs, but on fear, on silence, on the ability to disappear. The elders were hesitant. They had seen what the government's promises were worth, but they also saw something else, a chance to reclaim power, to take the old ways, the sacred ways, and turn them into something the enemy could never understand. And so, the canyon opened. It wasn't marked on any map. It had no name, just walls of stone and wind that never stopped moving. There, the first recruits were broken down, stripped of language, of identity, of time. They were taught to walk without sound, to kill without touch, to haunt without being seen. They were not soldiers. They were shadows. The training was brutal. Days without food, nights without sleep, rituals that blurred the line between memory and myth. They learned to see in the dark, to hear what others couldn't, to become something more than human and less. When they emerged, they were ready. Europe, the Pacific, Okinawa, Korea. They were sent where fear was needed most, and they delivered. Entire enemy units collapsed without a single shot fired. Men were found dead in caves, their faces frozen in terror, their weapons untouched. Others simply vanished, leaving behind only strange symbols carved into trees or spirals drawn in the dirt. The enemy called them ghosts. The Americans called them assets. But they called themselves nothing at all, because names were for the living. When the war ended, the world moved on. Celebrations filled the streets, flags waved, medals were pinned. But not for them. There were no parades for the shadows, no homecomings, no graves. They were erased. The files were burned, the canyon sealed, the names blacked out, the program forgotten. But the silence didn't last. In the decades that followed, young men began to disappear again, not in battle, but from their homes, from their schools, from their families. Always the same pattern: a black sedan, a knock at the door, a promise of service, and then nothing. Some called it recruitment, others called it abduction, but the truth was older than either. The canyon had reopened. The program had a new name now, Nightwind. A new generation of shadows, trained not just in silence, but in manipulation, in infiltration, in psychological collapse. They were sent into Cold War hotspots, Laos, Iran, Berlin. They didn't fight battles, they ended them before they began. They planted fear like seeds and watched it grow. But the cost was steep. Many never returned. Others came back wrong. Speaking in tongues, drawing symbols in their sleep, seeing things no one else could see. One called himself Hollow Wind. He wandered the desert barefoot, whispering to the rocks. When asked where he had been, he said, "With the ones who never left." And then he vanished too. But the story didn't die. A journalist found a tape, a photo, a spiral carved in stone. She followed the trail. She found the canyon. She found the truth. And then she disappeared. Her car was found abandoned, a spiral drawn in dust on the windshield. The government denied everything. The files were sealed, the witnesses silenced, but the symbols kept appearing, on walls, on trees, in dreams. The children of the shadows began to awaken. They didn't know why, but they remembered. They remembered the silence, the rituals, the fear. They remembered the wind. And now the wind is moving again. This is not just a story about war. It's a story about what happens when ancient knowledge is twisted into a weapon, when silence becomes strategy, when ghosts are trained to kill. It's about the men who were never meant to be remembered and the legacy that refused to die. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were something else. They were the wind, and the wind does not forget.